Hi everyone, myself Dr. Pradeep Reddy, Associate Professor, SAIS University, Bhopal. In this video, I would like to bring you about the structure of Indian banking system. So many of the viewers are asking about to know about structure of Indian banking system. So I have made an attempt to explain you in detail about the structure of Indian banking system. So let us see the introduction about this. So banking in India in the modern sense originated in the last decades of the 18th century. The first banks were Bank of Hindustan, which was established in 1770 to 1829, and the General Bank of India, established 1786 and since defunct. And the largest bank and the oldest still in existence is the State Bank of India, which originated in the Bank of Calcutta in June 1806, which almost immediately became the Bank of Bengal. This was one of the three presidency banks, the other two being the Bank of Bombay and the Bank of Madras, all three of which were established under charters from the British East India Company. The three banks were merged in 1921 to form the Imperial Bank of India, which upon India's independence became the State Bank of India in 1955. For many years, the presidency banks acted as quasi-central banks and did their successors until the Reserve Bank of India was established in 1935. And now, in 1969, Indian government nationalized all the major banks that it did not already own, and these have remained under government ownership. They are run under the structure known as profit-making public sector undertaking, shortly called as PSUs, and are allowed to compete and operate as commercial banks. The Indian banking sector is made up of four types of banks, as well as the PSUs and the state banks. They have been joined since 1990 by new private commercial banks and a number of foreign banks. So banking in India was generally fairly mature in terms of supply, product range, and reach, even though reach in rural India and to the poor still remains a challenge. So the government has developed initiatives to address this through the State Bank of India, expanding its branch network, and through the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development with things like microfinance. And next is, you can see the Indian banking system at a glance. You can see the RBI as the apex bank, and it was again divided into scheduled banks and unscheduled banks. And scheduled banks were again divided into two. One is commercial banks and the other one is cooperative banks. And commercial banks were again divided into public sector banks, private sector banks, foreign banks, and regional rural banks. And again, public sector banks, you will be knowing SBI and its associates and other nationalized banks and other public sector banks. Whereas in private sector banks, as we know that we already have the examples like ICICI, HDFC, Yes Bank, and other Axis banks. And we have foreign banks like Standard Chartered and Citibank and HSBC. And we have regional rural banks also set up. And again, these cooperative banks, on the other hand, are divided into urban cooperatives and state cooperatives. And let us see the Reserve Bank of India, which was established in 1935 as an apex body of Indian banking system, and its headquarters is in Mumbai. And India's monetary authority and supervisory of financial system, and it is acting as the issuer of currency and banker to bank and banker to government, and maintains financial stability. So these are the general functions that are performed by Reserve Bank of India. And whereas the scheduled banks are those banks whose name appears in the second schedule of Reserve Bank of India Act 1934, and non-scheduled banks are those banks whose name does not appear in the second schedule of Reserve Bank of India Act 1934. And these are the banks under scheduled banks, you can see which comes under commercial banks and cooperative banks. Commercial banks, they are the banks mainly deal with commercial banking operations like acceptance of deposits and granting loans to the public, and they are mainly classified into four. They are public sector banks. You can see the examples here: State Bank of India, like Bank of Baroda, Syndicate Bank, Vijaya Bank, which was earlier, and Canara Bank also. And private sector banks, you can see here the examples are wherein the management is fully controlled by private institutions or individuals, not by the government, like ICICI Bank, HDFC, Axis Bank, and others. And the third one is foreign banks. So these banks are formed and registered in foreign countries and have their head office in foreign country. As far as India is concerned, any bank registered outside India and have a branch in India is a foreign bank. Examples are S Bank, Citibank, HSBC, and Dutch Bank, and others. And the regional rural banks are, which were established by Regional Rural Banks Act 1976 with a view to satisfy the banking facilities and credit needs of the rural people, like Andhra Pradesh Grameen Vikas Bank, Chaitanya Godavari Grameen Bank, and Kerala Grameen Bank, and others. And next, if you see the cooperative banks, so these are the banks which are formed under cooperative societies that are formed at a state or district level, have a share of more than 51%. These are primarily set up for the purpose of services like for the farming community and to aid in land or infrastructure development at the state or district level. And there are two again, urban cooperative banks, and again we have state cooperative banks. So in urban cooperative banks, if you see, the thought, though not formally defined, refers to primary cooperative banks located in urban and semi-urban areas. These banks till 1996 were allowed to lend money only for non-agricultural purposes. This distinction does not hold today, and these banks were traditionally centered around communities, localities, workplace groups. So they essentially lend to small borrowers and businesses. And the state cooperative banks are the apex cooperative institutions in a state, and they are federations of district cooperative banks, and they monitor the activities of all cooperatives in the state. Example are the Kerala state cooperatives, Orissa state cooperative, and for every, keep in mind that for every state, there will be a state cooperative bank. And next, if you see, National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, shortly called as NABARD. It is a bank for agriculture and rural development, which is established as an apex bank that provides finance for agricultural and rural development. And that's all about the Indian banking structure. I hope that you have understood very well. And let us really explain you in short about the nationalization of banks in my next video. Thank you, everyone.